number. My brother froze my permits with fake complaints. His PDF metadata exposed him. My permits got frozen over an anonymous complaint. I didn't need a name to know who'd filed it. I found out on an ordinary Monday, walking into my own office with a coffee in hand, ready for a normal week of site visits and permit follow-ups. Instead, an official notice was waiting on my desk: construction permits for 2 of my active projects placed under a temporary administrative hold, triggered by an anonymous code enforcement complaint. The complaints were specific enough to trigger that kind of hold, not because the city had actually proven anything, but because asbestos and scaffolding claims require review before work can legally continue, a distinction the city takes seriously, regardless of whether the underlying claim ever turns out to be true. That distinction mattered later. In the moment, it just meant the hold made me look guilty before anyone had actually inspected anything. 10 minutes of searching turned up the source everyone in the industry was apparently already reading. A real estate blog, anonymous by design, calling me a bloodsucker preying on longtime residents, dressing up displacement fears in language that sounded practiced, rehearsed, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn before I even finished the paragraph. I read it twice, sitting perfectly still at my desk, coffee going cold beside my keyboard. The phrasing wasn't just familiar. It was specific, the kind of borrowed business jargon I'd heard 1,000 times before, always from the same person, always delivered with the same performative confidence I'd grown up watching from across the dinner table. I didn't need a byline to know exactly who'd written it. I sat there for a while, letting the initial shock settle into something more useful, something closer to focus. Whatever this was going to turn into, panicking at my desk on a Monday morning wasn't going to help. I should explain who I actually am and how I got here. I'm a partner at a small community restoration real estate firm, the kind of work that's slow, unglamorous, and rarely photographs well. I built my share of it entirely myself, working nights at a grocery store all through college, saving quietly, buying and restoring one commercial property at a time over years nobody in my family ever paid much attention to. There was a stretch in my late 20s where I worked 2 jobs simultaneously just to make a down payment on my first property, a rundown storefront nobody else wanted, and I never once mentioned it at a family dinner because I already knew how the conversation would go. They knew, vaguely, that I did real estate. They never asked follow-up questions, never wanted to see a spreadsheet or a before and after photo, never once asked how the financing actually worked. I was the family's background noise. That suited me fine, until it didn't. My younger brother Ryan, by contrast, built an entire persona out of being loud. A hustle vlogger, always online, always narrating some new venture in borrowed business jargon that sounded impressive and rarely meant much of anything once you actually pressed for details. He posted from rooftops, from car interiors, from anywhere with decent lighting and a skyline behind him, always some version of the same story about grinding his way to success that never quite matched up with anything concrete. One video I half-watched once had him talking for 4 full minutes about vertical integration without ever explaining what business he was actually integrating. He was the center of every family gathering, the one our parents bragged about at dinner parties, despite never once building anything close to what I'd quietly assembled over a decade of nights and weekends. He'd built an image. I'd built an actual company. At a backyard barbecue a few weeks before any of this started, my Uncle Larry, a few beers in, and meaning no harm at all, mentioned offhand how impressed he was that I'd quietly picked up several major commercial properties downtown, naming 2 of them specifically, numbers attached that I'd never intended to share at a family gathering, let alone one with Ryan sitting 3 feet away holding a plate of potato salad. I watched Ryan's face change in real time. Not confusion. Something colder, something I hadn't seen on him before, his usual easy charm faltering for just a second before he covered it with a laugh that didn't quite land right. "Didn't know you were playing in that league now," he said, voice light, eyes not matching it at all. "It's not really a competition," I said. "Everything's a competition," he said, and this time he wasn't smiling, setting his plate down on the table between us with more force than the moment really called for. Our mother tried to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, asking about dessert, but I noticed Ryan didn't say another word to me for the rest of the afternoon, his eyes tracking me from across the yard every time I moved. Every time someone else at the table asked me a follow-up question about the properties Larry had just named, I watched my brother's face change, and I knew this wasn't over. Over the following weeks, that anonymous blog kept posting, each entry a little sharper than the last, accusing me of predatory urban renewal, displacing longtime residents, using language dressed up in the exact same buzzwords Ryan had used online for years, though never once attaching his actual name to any of it. One post even used a phrase I'd heard him say out loud at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, word for word, like he'd simply copied and pasted his own personality into a new byline. I forwarded a few of the posts to my business partner, who read them with the same slow, dawning recognition I'd had, though neither of us said the obvious thing out loud yet. The words were his, even if his name wasn't. The blog was never the piece that could actually prove anything on its own. It was the smoke. The PDF, when I finally found it, would turn out to be the matchbook with his name still printed on it. I started keeping a folder of screenshots after that, dating each post, noting the phrasing that matched, building something without quite deciding yet what I was building it for. Then came the code enforcement complaints, asbestos concerns, unsafe scaffolding, backed by photographs taken from an oddly specific angle on a rooftop parking structure 2 blocks away. I recognized that angle immediately. It was the same one Ryan used in half his old bragging videos, the same skyline shot he'd used to narrate his own success a dozen times online, down to the exact railing visible in the corner of the frame. I actually pulled up one of his old videos on my phone that night, sitting in my car outside my own office, comparing the 2 images side by side until there was no room left for doubt. My permits froze within days, and my biggest investor pulled out shortly after, citing vague reputational risk in an email that took him 4 sentences to avoid saying anything specific at all. He'd used his own bragging footage to build a case against me. I called my lawyer that same night, not entirely sure yet what I was asking her to help me with, only that I needed someone else to confirm I wasn't imagining the pattern forming in front of me. I learned soon after why the timing mattered so much. A company called New Roots Collective, fronted publicly by Ryan and his girlfriend Celine, a brand consultant who spoke almost entirely in buzzwords, had submitted a competing bid for the same Hawthorne lot. My firm had spent months developing a community-backed redevelopment plan around. Their pitch language echoed my own public materials closely enough that it couldn't have been coincidence, entire phrases lifted almost verbatim from a proposal document I'd shared with exactly 3 people outside my own firm. The leak, it turned out, traced back to the investor who later pulled out. He admitted it eventually, through his assistant more than directly, that Celine had reached out weeks earlier asking to see market context for the Hawthorne lot, and he'd forwarded her an older draft of my public-facing proposal without thinking much of it at the time. That explained why New Roots had my language but never my actual numbers. They'd copied the surface and missed the structure underneath entirely. This was never about violations. It was about the land. I sat with that realization for a long time, running back through every escalation of the last month, with this new context attached to it, the blog, the fake violations, all of it suddenly making a different, colder kind of sense than I'd let myself believe before. He hadn't been trying to hurt me for the sake of it. He'd been clearing a path. With permits still frozen and legal fees mounting fast, my cash reserves started shrinking in a way that scared me more than I let myself admit out loud, even to my own business partner, who I caught glancing at our shared accounting software more often than usual that month. The city's committee vote on Hawthorne was approaching on its own schedule, indifferent to how much runway I actually had left to fight back, indifferent to whose family this was tearing apart in the meantime. I ran the numbers late one night, alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home, and realized, with a kind of cold clarity, exactly how narrow the window had become. I had weeks left, maybe less, to prove any of this. I stopped sleeping well around that point, though I never once considered giving up the property or the fight over it. Some things, once you've built them from nothing, you don't hand over just because someone louder decided they wanted them more. My friend Malik, who works in city planning, didn't leak me anything. That mattered, and I made sure to keep it that way. He simply told me where the committee's uploads went once. A proposal became part of the public packet, an old planning portal. Most people never bothered checking because it looked like it had been built in 2004 and actively resented anyone who tried to use it. I pulled the New Roots Collective PDF myself that night, downloaded straight from the public submission, and opened the file properties out of nothing more than habit. The file properties still listed the original author as Ryan Foster, last modified by Celine Marr, a cloud path visible right there in the same panel. Users: Ryan Foster, New Roots, Hawthorne, bid, final, PDF. The document's created date sat 3 days before New Roots Collective ever officially appeared on a single city filing. He'd scrubbed the story out of the proposal itself. He hadn't scrubbed the file. He never bothered to check what the file itself was saying about him. I remember laughing out loud at my own kitchen table, a short, disbelieving sound in an otherwise empty apartment. It was just genuinely funny, in a bleak sort of way, how careless the whole thing had been underneath all that polish. A quick LLC registry search confirmed the rest. New Roots Collective's official address was a rented mailbox at a UPS store 15 minutes from Ryan's apartment, the kind of place that rents boxes by the month to anyone with a driver's license. The listed phone number didn't appear anywhere before that, not in business filings, not in old listings, not in any of Ryan's own public materials, and the first place it ever surfaced was the New Roots registration itself, filed the same week my permit hold notice went out. And buried in an old podcast archive, a show Ryan had guested on nearly a year earlier. Something about founder mindset I vaguely remembered him mentioning at a family dinner. I found a clip timestamped 14, Sanchersan. His voice casually claiming credit for his Hawthorne project to an interviewer, months before any bid had ever actually been filed with the city. He'd bragged about stealing my project before he'd even filed the paperwork. I saved that clip in 3 different places that same night. An old instinct from years of backing up work files kicking in, without me even thinking about it consciously. My lawyer made me slow down before I used any of it. Screenshots were useful, she said, but the submitted PDF mattered more if I could preserve the original download, the public portal timestamp, and the file properties exactly as they appeared that night. So I downloaded a clean copy again, saved the portal receipt, exported the properties panel, and sent everything to her before touching the file a second time. It felt excessive while I was doing it. Almost paranoid, but she was right. If Ryan wanted to call the whole thing personal, the only answer was to make the evidence boring, traceable, and impossible to accuse me of editing. With guidance from my old professor, Dr. Varma, who I hadn't spoken to in years before this but who answered my email within an hour anyway, seemingly delighted to be asked, I pivoted my own Hawthorne proposal fully into a community-backed model, spending the following weeks gathering testimonials from local business owners who'd actually be affected by whatever happened to that lot, sitting across from shop owners and longtime tenants who'd never once been asked what they actually wanted from a developer. One woman who'd run a bakery on that block for 11 years cried a little when I asked her what she hoped the space would become, and I realized, sitting there with my notebook, that this was the part of the work I'd always actually cared about, buried under months of legal noise. I wanted my case to stand entirely on its own merit before I ever needed to mention my brother's name at all, before I ever gave the council a single reason to think this was about anything other than the project itself. I wanted to win this even if I never mentioned his name. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. If the committee chose my proposal only because Ryan looked dishonest, then he would still have managed to make the room about him one way or another. I wanted the bakery owner's letter, the financing schedule, and the tenant protections to stand first on their own weight. The exposure folder was there to stop a lie, not to replace the work. There was a version of the next few weeks where I spent all my energy fighting the blog directly, posting rebuttals, calling out the borrowed language line by line for anyone paying attention. I considered it more than once, usually around 2 in the morning when the anger felt most convincing. I decided against it every time. Rather than engaging publicly with the anonymous blog or with Ryan's online audience, trading barbs in a comment section, neither of us would come out of looking good. I decided to save everything for the one room where it would actually matter. The night before the hearing, I printed both document sets, community support in one folder, shell company exposure in the other, and laid them side by side on my kitchen table, checking every page twice, making sure nothing was out of order. Nothing left to chance in front of a room that would only get one shot at hearing it right. My business partner called around midnight just to ask if I was actually going to sleep before tomorrow. I told her I would. I didn't, not really, lying awake running through the order of the second folder over and over until it felt automatic. I wasn't going to win a comment war. I was going to win a vote. I finally fell asleep sometime past 2, the folders still sitting neatly on the table where I'd left them, ready for whatever the next morning actually brought. Ryan and Celine presented first at the hearing, all confidence and polish. Walking the council through New Roots Collective's pitch in a dense wall of borrowed language, adaptive reuse, synergy, community-forward placemaking that sounded impressive and said almost nothing concrete at all. Celine handled most of the slides, gesturing at renderings that looked more like mood boards than actual plans. All soft lighting and stock photos of people laughing over coffee. Ryan chimed in every so often with a line that sounded rehearsed even by his standards. The same easy charm he'd always used at family dinners, now landing flat against a room of people who clearly wanted numbers instead of vibes. By the third slide, at least 2 council members were visibly checking their phones, and the committee chair asked, not unkindly, whether they had any specifics on financing. He still thought the room would believe the language instead of the facts. I sat quietly in my chair through all of it, folders closed in my lap, waiting for my turn without a hint of the satisfaction I actually felt building underneath my composure. When I stepped up, I opened with the first folder: testimonials, transparent local data, the case built entirely on its own weight. 3 business owners' letters read into the record by the clerk before I'd even said a word myself, the bakery owner's letter drawing an audible sound of sympathy from somewhere in the gallery. I let that sit for a moment before moving on. Then I opened the second folder, the LLC registry showing a UPS store mailbox posing as a corporate address. The listed phone number appearing for the first time on New Roots Collective's filing the same week my permit hold notice went out. The PDF properties listing Ryan Foster as original author, Celine Marr as last modified by, and the cloud path, users, Ryan Foster, New Roots, Hawthorne, bid, final, PDF, still sitting inside the submitted file, projected on the screen behind me large enough for the entire room to read for themselves, no interpretation required. And finally, the podcast clip, timestamp 14:33, Ryan's own voice filling the chamber through the room's speakers, claiming credit for a project he hadn't yet even bid on, months before any of this had officially begun. I didn't editorialize a single word of it. I let each piece land, paused, and moved to the next. Nobody in that room needed me to accuse him of anything. His own file did that. I closed the second folder and sat back down without another word, letting the silence in that chamber do whatever work was left to be done. The chair called a 10-minute recess after the podcast clip finished playing. City Council leaned over the dais beside her, both of them paging through the submitted packet while Ryan sat very still next to Celine, neither of them speaking. When the committee finally returned, the chair didn't mention my brother by name at all. She simply said the committee would be evaluating both proposals based on documented capacity, verified community support, and the integrity of the submitted materials. After a brief deliberation, murmurs passing between council members who barely bothered to lower their voices, the committee chair called for a vote. It came back unanimous, 10-0, awarding the Hawthorne lot and its development funding to my firm. Ryan sat frozen beside Celine, his easy charm nowhere to be found, staring at the same screen the whole room had just watched. Celine was already quietly gathering her things before the meeting had even formally closed, not once looking back at him on her way out, her heels clicking against the floor, the only sound in an otherwise silent chamber. 10 votes. Not one of them was his. I shook Dr. Varma's hand outside the chamber afterward, and Malik's too, both of them grinning wider than I felt comfortable matching just yet, still processing the fact that it was actually over. Within days of the hearing going semi-public, clips of it circulating in exactly the kind of local circles that mattered, Ryan's remaining investors pulled out entirely, one of them reportedly citing the metadata screenshot alone as reason enough, forwarding it to 2 other people who'd been considering putting money in as well. Celine formally removed her name from every New Roots Collective material still online, scrubbing her own portfolio site of any mention of the project within 48 hours, replacing it with a vague line about brand pivots that fooled absolutely nobody who'd actually watched the hearing. Ryan deleted the brand's social accounts within the week, all of it simply gone one morning without any explanation posted anywhere. Years of content vanishing in what must have been a single late-night decision, and his once glossy podcast quietly pivoted to somber lessons from failure content by the end of the month. A tonal shift nobody who knew him found even slightly convincing, myself included. The image only ever worked as long as nobody looked underneath it. I didn't feel triumphant hearing about any of it secondhand, the way I might have expected to a few months earlier. Mostly I just felt tired and relieved and ready to get back to the actual work waiting for me at Hawthorne. I broke ground on the Hawthorne redevelopment a few months later. The bakery owner from the hearing came by on the first morning with a box of pastries and stood beside the temporary fence longer than she needed to, watching the crew mark the first lines into the dirt. No cameras, no podcast, no skyline monologue. Just work beginning where noise had finally run out. Family dinners changed after that, but not in the way I used to imagine wanting. My parents asked real questions now: permits, timelines, financing, and I answered some of them. Not all. Old habits, I suppose, the kind that don't unlearn themselves just because the circumstances finally shifted in my favor. Ryan sat quieter at the table, smaller somehow, like the room had finally stopped bending around him. I didn't need them to understand everything anymore. The first storefront opened 9 months later. I stood across the street that morning, coffee in hand, watching people walk into a place my brother had tried to take from me before it ever existed, the bakery owner already setting up a small table out front with a hand-lettered sign nobody had asked her to make. He wanted the image. I kept the building.